December 16th, 1944. Early morning, Mona, Germany. The frozen earth trembled as another salvo of American artillery screamed overhead. German soldiers crouched low in muddy foxholes, their breath misting in the frigid air. The forest reeked of cordite and pine sap, a strange mix of death and life. Hans, barely 21, gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles were pale. He hadn't eaten properly in days, and the gnawing hunger mixed with fear made his stomach twist painfully. The sound of tanks rolled like thunder somewhere in the distance, shaking the ground. Somewhere close by, a comrade muttered a prayer under his breath, voice trembling. Nobody knew whether they would live to see another sunrise. This was the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, a final desperate gamble by the German army. The snow-covered forest felt like the edge of the world. Shells burst close enough to shower them with dirt and frozen snow. Hans forced himself to breathe, every muscle tight as a drawn bow. He thought of his village far away, the smell of bread in his mother's kitchen, the sound of the church bells, memories that felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Somewhere an officer shouted, and the whistle blast came. Hans leapt from the trench with the others, boots crunching in the snow, running into the storm of fire. The German assault struck with ferocity just before dawn. Mortars screamed, machine guns rattled, and the sky turned to smoke. Hans ran with his unit through the trees, his rifle clutched tight, heart hammering in his chest. The snow was slick with ice, men slipped, some never got up again. An American soldier appeared suddenly from behind a pine, his rifle raised. For a brief heartbeat their eyes met, both just boys in enemy uniforms. Hans fired first. The soldier dropped, face first into the snow. Hans stumbled past him, throat dry, his insides twisting. There was no time to think, no time to feel. The battle roared around him like a living thing, deafening, blinding. By midday, the Germans had gained ground, but at a cost that made any victory feel bitter. Hans watched as stretcher-bearers carried away the wounded, leaving dark red trails on the white snow. That night they took shelter in the ruins of a farmhouse, huddled together for warmth. Hans lay awake staring at the black rafters, unable to sleep. The cries of the wounded still echoed in his ears. He wondered if God was listening to them out here on this frozen battlefield. The fighting dragged on for days. Villages changed hands. Forests turned into killing fields. The cold was merciless, gnawing at fingers and toes until they were numb and black. Hans shared his last crust of bread with a wounded friend whose pale face told him the boy wouldn't live until morning. When the end came, Hans closed his comrade's eyes with shaking hands and whispered a prayer over him. The snow kept falling, covering the dead like an unasked-for shroud. Soon the Americans brought in air power. The roar of planes filled the sky. Bombs tore apart roads and supply lines, throwing everything into chaos. Hans's unit was ordered to hold a crucial crossroads no matter the cost. They dug in, frostbitten and exhausted, their lips cracked and bleeding. When the attack came, it felt like the earth itself had decided to swallow them. Tanks rolled forward, shells exploded, and the world became a storm of fire and steel. Hans kept firing until his rifle clicked empty, then grabbed another from a dead comrade. The battle felt endless, time blurring until day and night were meaningless. When it finally ended, the crossroads was littered with shattered bodies, and Hans was still somehow breathing. By the end of January, the German offensive had stalled. What had been hailed as Hitler's last great gamble was now little more than a slow retreat. Hans limped with the survivors back through burned-out villages, where civilians stared with haunted eyes or turned their backs. Some spat as the soldiers passed. The war had eaten away at everyone, soldier and villager alike. By the time Hans crossed back into German-held lines, he was only a shadow of the boy who had left his village. Officers spoke of regrouping, of fighting again, but Hans could see it in every man's face. They were finished. The trees stood blackened, the sky heavy and gray. At night, Hans lay awake listening to the distant thunder of Allied artillery, inching closer with each passing day. He thought about what would become of him if he survived. When the Americans captured him weeks later, he did not resist. He simply dropped his rifle and raised his hands. In that moment, surrender felt like mercy, like the first breath after nearly drowning. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the camp was filled with noise. Some men cheered wildly, others wept. Hans simply sat on his bunk, staring at the floor, feeling hollow. He thought of all those who would never go home, of the friends buried in snow and mud, of the villages that no longer existed. Repatriation took months. Hans worked quietly in the kitchen while he waited, peeling potatoes, listening to American guards talk about baseball and weekend dances. He learned some English words, enough to greet them, enough to say thank you. When the day finally came to leave, he boarded the ship with a strange heaviness. The Atlantic crossing was gray and rough, and Hans spent hours standing on deck staring at the endless water, wondering what kind of life waited for him on the other side. When the ship docked in Europe, he saw his homeland for the first time in years, and it was unrecognizable. Cities lay in ruins, roads were nothing but craters and dust. Germany was no longer the country he had left. Hans finally returned to his village weeks later, traveling by train and then on foot. The fields were overgrown, the houses scarred by shell fire. But the church still stood. When his mother saw him, she collapsed into tears, clutching him as though afraid he might vanish again. Hans cried too, for everything he had lost, for everything that had somehow survived. Life after the war was not easy. There was little food, little money, and the shadow of the past hung over every conversation. Neighbors spoke in hushed voices about who had collaborated, who had disappeared, who had never come back. Hans worked in the fields from sunrise to sunset. His hands blistered, but grateful to have work at all. Some nights he woke screaming. The crossroads, the boy he shot, the faces of the dead flashing before his eyes. But then he would hear his mother's voice, soft and steady, and he would force himself to breathe until the panic passed. Slowly the seasons turned. Grass grew over old trenches. Flowers bloomed where shells had once fallen. Life was fragile, but it was returning. Over the next months, Hans tried to rebuild himself along with the farm. He patched roofs, mended fences, and bartered with neighbors for seeds and tools. Slowly, the village began to look like itself again, though scars would always remain. One day, an American relief convoy passed through, bringing food and medicine. The villagers gathered to watch. Hans saw their uniforms and felt his stomach tighten. But these soldiers were different. They smiled, handed out bread, gave chocolate to children. One of them even nodded to Hans and offered him a cigarette. Hans hesitated, then accepted. As he smoked, he thought of the guards back in the POW camp who had treated him like a human being. It did not erase what had happened, but it softened something inside him. For the first time since the war, Hans felt the faint possibility of forgiveness, not only from others, but from himself. Winter came again, and with it the memories seemed sharper. The first snowfall made Hans shiver as though he were back in the Ardennes, back at the crossroads. But this time he was standing in his own field, holding a spade instead of a rifle. His younger brother, now strong enough to help with the farm, joined him in the work. They chopped wood together, repaired the barn. In the evenings they sat by the fire, listening to the old radio, hearing about trials in Nuremberg, about justice being served. Hans felt conflicted. Part of him was glad to hear the guilty were being punished. Part of him feared that the world would never see him as anything but a soldier, a part of that war machine. Still he worked day after day, letting the rhythm of planting and harvest slowly wear down the edges of his pain. By 1947, Hans had begun to speak more with the villagers. At first, people were wary. Some looked at him as though he carried a stain that would never wash off. But as time passed, they saw he was just another survivor, trying to build a future. He volunteered to help repair the schoolhouse, carrying bricks and timber. He helped a widow gather firewood before the first frost. He began to smile again, though the smile always carried a trace of sadness. One spring day, he walked past the church and heard the choir practicing. The sound made him stop, his chest tight. It reminded him of the days before the war, when he had been just a boy, when the future had seemed wide and full of promise. He stood outside listening until the song ended. Something inside him shifted. He felt for the first time that maybe there could be a life beyond the shadow of the war. Hans met Anna in the summer of 1948. She had lost her father and 2 brothers in the war, yet she smiled with a quiet strength that amazed him. They met first at the market, then again at a neighbor's wedding. Slowly, conversation turned into companionship. Anna asked him once about the war, about what he had seen. Hans hesitated, then told her as much as he could bear to share. She did not flinch, did not turn away. Instead, she put her hand over his and said quietly, "You came home. That's enough." Her words stayed with him long after. For the first time, Hans allowed himself to imagine a future, a real one, with love and family and something more than survival. He began to repair the old farmhouse. thinking perhaps it could hold more than just memories. The years that followed were still hard. There were shortages, arguments, bad harvests. But there were also good days. Hans and Anna were married in a small ceremony, the church filled with neighbors who had once been strangers in grief. Hans stood at the altar feeling both terrified and grateful. When Anna smiled at him, it felt like light breaking through clouds. They built a life together, piece by piece. Sometimes at night, Hans still woke in a cold sweat. But now Anna was there to hold him until the tremors stopped. Slowly the nightmares came less often. The farm began to thrive again, and Hans took pride in watching the fields turn green under the summer sun. He began to laugh again, though the laugh always seemed to come from somewhere deep and quiet. In 1950, Hans welcomed his first child, a son. When he held the baby in his arms, he felt something crack open inside him. All the years of pain, fear, and guilt seemed to pour out as tears. He promised himself that his son would never see what he had seen, would never carry the weight of war on his shoulders. Life was still not easy, but Hans felt a strength he hadn't known he still possessed. He worked longer hours, repaired the barn roof, planted more crops. At night he would sit by the fire with Anna and watch their son sleep. Sometimes he would think of the American camp, of the guards who had given him bread and treated him like a man. Perhaps he thought the world could be different for his son. As the decade passed, Hans became something of a quiet leader in the village. People came to him for advice, for help with repairs, for a steady hand when disputes broke out. Hans never sought this role, but he accepted it. He knew what it meant to lose everything, and he knew how hard it was to rebuild. The war had left scars on everyone, but it had also taught them resilience. Sometimes Hans would walk out to the edge of his fields and stand there at sunset, looking at the horizon. He would think about the past, about the boy he had been, about the snow, the crossroads, the faces of those who never came back. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled him. He could breathe through it now. He could stand in the quiet and feel something close to peace. Hans lived long enough to see his children grow, to see the village rebuilt, to see new houses where rubble had once been. He grew old working the same fields he had once returned to as a broken young man. The nightmares still came from time to time, but they no longer consumed him. When he told his children about the war, he did not speak of glory or victory. He spoke of hunger, of fear, of friends lost too soon. He told them that life was precious, that peace was fragile, that they must never take it for granted. On warm summer evenings, he would sit outside the farmhouse with Anna, watching the sun sink low. The grass was green again. The air smelled of earth and grain, and for the first time in many years, Hans truly felt at home. He had survived, and he had learned that survival was only the beginning. Living, truly living, was the hardest and most beautiful thing of all.